This conference will now be recorded.
I'm sorry, Jeff, what was that?
May the force be with them.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so it is 9:01, so we should call this meeting to order. And we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd please stand and find a flag. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands,
one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Let's do the roll, shall we? Director Johnson.
Here.
Good morning. Director Moran.
Here.
Howdy, howdy. Vice President Baker.
Here.
There she is. President Dice.
I'm here.
Good morning. And Mr. Duncan is here in spirit. I'm sure he would prefer to be here, or maybe not, if he would prefer to be here. It's a toss-up, but anyway,
well,
we miss him.
I would think that the medical procedure would probably always take precedent. So I hope
I'm just not sure where he would rather be. Right.
Yeah, I hope he will be well. Okay, then. We have an agenda before us, and if there are no objections or changes requested to the agenda, I will entertain a vote to approve it.
Moved.
You know what I mean.
Second.
Thank you. Moved by Diane, seconded by Tammy, or to approve today's agenda. And if there are no objections from either the directors or the public, I will call the roll. Director Johnson.
Aye.
Director Moran.
Aye.
Director Baker.
Aye.
And I also approve. So we're going forward with the agenda we have. Are there any comments from the public or requests for future agenda items? Hearing and seeing none. Are there any comments from the directors? We are a quiet bunch today. How about correspondence received from the public, Mr. Poole?
Equally as quiet. Nothing to report.
Okay, well, I guess that means we can move down to section 2, the items for board consideration. The Borrego Springs Sub-Basin Water Master Board. I know that I think everybody on this board was at the Water Master meeting last week. And does anybody have any comments or anything they want to talk about in terms of what happened at the last meeting with the Water Master?
I guess I do. As I
Diane.
said at the meeting, I was glad to see a discussion of PMAs and honoring the GMP come up. As I also said, I was a little alarmed that the table that I guess Samantha did showing a requirement in the GMP and how it was being addressed was really only referring to the judgment and the GMP kind of in passing. And I think the whole board, except Dave, kind of need to be reminded about Sigma. And I wish it were coming from John Markman or Andy or Samantha. I'm not sure who the right person is. So, yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll probably be talking about composing a letter here after we get our presentation from Trey. Tammy, did you have anything?
I would share Diane's concerns. The water master doesn't move forward as quickly as we would like him in sort of all elements of implementing Sigma. Overall, I agree with a lot of people who said the annual report was good. There are a few things here and there about quoting perhaps the judgment more than Sigma, but otherwise I do think that it was a much better annual report, and I think that part went well. And I am happy to see that the water master has agreed to have staff start to work on the PMAs, the management actions required by Sigma, over the objections of one director, that nonetheless that staff is going to begin to work on that, though I think we have to be patient, more patient than we want to be, is at the pace at which they will work on it. But yay, one step in that direction is a good step.
All right. Anyone else? I know, oh, Jeff.
Yeah. Part of the Prop 68 grant discussion evolved around some of the individual components and moving of dollars and schedules around. And in essence, changing some of the components of the Prop 68 grant. And one in particular was mentioned, and it kind of surprised me, especially some of the words used by the county representative. Really surprised me about the inaccuracy, or I'm not sure he used the word defensibility, but that's kind of what I heard, kind of like the legal defensibility of the inflow numbers that we have. I think Mark Jorgensen did hey man, we really need to know inflow, and kind of sitting there thinking the same thing, that inflow is very important, and then almost kind of discouraged that Jim, obviously he's a really smart guy, knows this basin as well as anyone, said, what we have, and like I said, I don't want to use the wrong words, but I'll just use, is inaccurate, and that repeating the same processes used before, and likely if we look for other ways to measure inflows, would be likely as inaccurate. And it was like, whoa, so like we're never going to know what the inflow number is here. And so Stephen Trey and I actually started a little email train a couple of days ago about this. And I said, man, and what the way I describe Sigma often is, Sigma's real simple. Inflow minus outflow equals 0. That's the whole goal. And so I even in my own brain got a little confused on really what's going on with Sigma, and is a really good understanding of inflow really important? Or can we live off of, groundwater elevation numbers and hydrologic models and the rest? And, Steve, thank you, reminded me that, it really isn't inflow minus outflow equals 0. That's my super paraphrased way to explain Sigma, but that's not it. It's all about that. And duh, I should remember this. We dealt with this for a long time, the undesirable results, right? So it gets, which is obviously all based around the PMAs, of which, declining groundwater levels, water quality, and a handful of other issues are, what we're trying to avoid with undesirable results. So, maybe I'm less panicking, not that I was, but less concerned about including inflow data into the grant. But once again, it's just kind of and I guess I knew it. We went through this, 7, 8 years ago with the whole GMP and GSP back in those days. But I guess I didn't realize how inaccurate it is and how we kind of don't know what the inflows are, and we might not ever know, which to me was kind of and it's okay that, knowing inflow, based on the emails I got from Steve, really isn't required as part of Sigma. It gets back to the undesirable results and the measurable objectives and the PMAs and the nuts and bolts out of the GMP. So for whatever that's worth, my brain went on a little tailspin over the last couple of days about inflow. Like, wow, that's just weird that we have no clue, and we'll probably never have an idea what the inflows are.
But isn't basin characterization an important part of Sigma? I know there's a big section on it. I don't remember how it feeds into the PMAs.
I would say, yeah, for background, yeah, but not for Sigma compliance. Understanding it, and explaining the basin hydrology and the geology and the whateverology is part of this, the GSP/GMP requirement. But to me, whoa, it's getting windy. It gets back to the undesirable results are what we have to really avoid in terms of purely from the implementation perspective. You're right, knowing that seems very important, but, and maybe Trey, they can help this, and Steve also, because we got into a really interesting little email chat over the last couple of days about this.
I feel like I remember that some of the failed GSPs, that DWR said try again, had failed at doing a good basin characterization, but I haven't looked at them for a while. Anyway, yeah, I'd be
No,
interested
that's
to
a great point, and Steve did mention that, and Steve actually, I think, even went a little further to say we might see some, hey, sure would be good if you had a better understanding of your inflow type of comment from DWR on the GMP, but that is possible. Obviously, we don't know for sure, and hopefully the comments will be here in the next, month or two, I guess 2. But
May I be heard on this, Madam President?
go for it, yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately Sigma is about avoiding undesirable results, but there's certainly things that go into your GMP that have to be accurate. And the water, I'll defer to Trey, but I don't know how you could have your water budget 100% accurate if you don't know or have a good handle on the inflows. So ultimately, the overarching thing in Sigma is to avoid undesirable results. But as you all know, in your GSP, GMP, you have to get it right as well. So I don't know, Trey, if you probably looked at all those kind of water budget and the best management practices documents more than I have. So maybe you have some insight.
I was a little surprised that there was so little, well, not enough interest in finding out more about what our actual inflow is. That was one of the tasks that was voted down. So guess we can.
Trey, are you trying to speak? It doesn't look like you're muted, but we can't hear you if you're trying to say something. We still can't hear you.
Okay.
Nope.
Who are you referring to, Jeff?
Trey.
Oh.
Trey. Can you not hear
Yeah.
me now? Oh, you can hear me. Oh, sorry. But yeah, Trey. It seems like he's trying to talk about it. Can't hear him.
Yeah, I can't hear you, Trey. Maybe call in?
Can you hear me now?
Yay, yes.
Oh, okay. The hidden mute button.
Okay.
Good morning, President
Good
Dice
morning.
and board members.
Good
Yeah,
morning.
this is a very, very technical issue, something we identified when we updated the model, the Borrego Valley hydrogeologic model for the groundwater sustainability plan. And essentially, we were not able to reproduce, and West Yost now has not been able to reproduce the inflows that the United States Geological Survey developed from the basin characterization model, which is a model that covers the entire state of California. So there's essentially a regression equation that's developed and calibrated to some of the historical streamflow data. And we don't know what that is. And we've asked the USGS a number of times to provide that information, and they have not been able to bring it forward. So it's really a technical issue that I think requires a little bit of more research. We're going to come back to the board in a month or so and Interra is going to provide you a proposal from our modelers to look into this a little bit more and have the ability to at least inform the process and what additional steps may be necessary to simply correct this technical uncertainty. I think it's important that we understand this just so we know how the model works. There's just uncertainty regarding it right now. We just really don't know how big of a potential technical issue this is. So we'll come back to you with some additional information, and I think we can get into the weeds a little bit more later in the process. But I do think it's important that in the next 2 years here, as we're updating the sustainable yield for the basin, that we kind of ground truth this issue.
Trey, when you've asked USGS folks, I guess maybe that's, what is it, Claudia Font, Cynthia, to explain their numbers, do you think they have simply not had time to try, or did they try and they couldn't figure it out either?
Again, there's some uncertainty. I think it's both that I have spoken with Claudia. I don't think she's the one. I mean, she was overseeing the entire project, but I got the sense that others did this particular technical aspect of the work, and that they're likely no longer with the USGS. So there just wasn't good documentation on how it was done. So we've been dealing with this issue now for half a decade or more, and we're just kind of at the point where we have to dig into it some more and figure out a path forward.
Any other questions, comments about that particular item? I'm going to ask Trey to also give us the annual report overview, if you don't mind, Trey.
Well, I do have one question just to get on the table here. I've wondered if it's possible to take like stream data that we have for those years when the station was working and try to correlate it like with rain in Anza or rain up in Ranchita, up at the head of our watershed, and sort of derive it that way. In other words, to come up with a theory that, when they got 10 inches of rain in Anza this year, then 2 years later, the stream data showed XYZ.
Diana, that's exactly what we do with these rainfall runoff relationships, is that we use the available historical stream flow data to calibrate for a particular watershed when it rains, how much runoff that watershed generates for different storm events. So that's part of the process that's involved with calibrating the basin characterization model, which is this statewide model, and you kind of have to downscale it to the local level. So one of the critical data inputs for that is actually stream flow data from a stream, so that way you can better understand how a particular watershed reacts to rainfall events.
Okay. Thanks. I was wondering if you could work from rain data to stream flow data, and then sort of when we're missing stream flow data, you could say, well, it did rain 8 inches that year up in Anza, so we guess that if the station had been there, it would have been, showing XYZ stream flow. Anyway, I won't. Maybe if
Yeah,
it's
and
if it's
that's how the models work, Diana, is that
okay.
we're basically, for years when we don't have data, we're using the historical data and the relationship that's been developed between rainfall and runoff to fill in the missing data, if you will. So
Great.
it's just that the equation that was developed to do that is a little bit uncertain at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
So Trey, I know you had some comments about the annual report, and would it be a good idea for for BWD to compose a letter regarding these points and send it back to the water master?
Overall, the annual report was very well done this year. There was just a few minor typos. On February 2nd, I provided the water master a track changes version in the Word document
Okay.
of those typos. There was nothing technically glaring that stood out that would require, I think, a letter at this point in time.
Okay.
I think it's acceptable to submit to the court and to Department of Water Resources. But overall, I think it was a great job by the Water Master staff, especially they definitely listened to our comments from last year and improved the process. So overall, I think it was a terrific effort. That said, I think 2 days ago now, I provided to the board members initial comments on the groundwater monitoring plan.
Okay.
I think that the plan provided a good overall review of the existing monitoring network, the methods used to collect and report data. But in terms of improving the network, there was a lack of specificity in additional wells to add and what steps the water master has taken now in the last several years to expand the network. The Borrego Water District has provided the water master specific wells to include such as Center Pivot and Viking, which are currently in the Prop 68 grant. There was not a discussion of those wells in the groundwater monitoring network. There also was no discussion of the technical support services agreement pending well with Department of Water Resources. So I think that certainly as we get through the TAC process on the groundwater monitoring network, that we need to kind of dig into the weeds a little bit more on how to better expand the network and fill data gaps. There's certainly several existing wells that can be included. And then in terms of filling additional data gaps, I think there's additional technical items such as aquifer testing, potentially well profiling and depth discrete water sampling that could be done on existing wells, and the groundwater monitoring plan that the water master has developed at this point was silent. So I think just high level, it was kind of maintain the existing network, that the process is now going to begin to seek additional wells, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done still.
Tammy.
Trey, I don't know if I caught this in the water master meeting that I think a Rams Hill well was pulled out of the monitoring network. Is that true, or did I misunderstand that?
No, the specific issue was in regards to the decline that's been documented at the Rams Hill wells. The system in the South Management area is a little bit different than other parts of the basin. It's semi-confined based on aquifer testing that was previously done out there. And they're pumping those wells fairly hard for the golf course. Typically, they're pumping about 800 acre feet on average per year down in that area. And because those wells are semi-confined, once you turn those wells off, they take a long time to recover. You're also likely getting some leakage from the return flows from the golf course irrigation over time. We suspect that based on some of the water quality trends we saw in the area, increasing nitrates in particular. but it just takes a long time for those wells to recover, and likely there is some likelihood that the sustainable yield of the South Management Area is less than uh, the current production, and this has been well documented now, going back over half a decade, that it was likely that the South Management Area could not sustain the production necessary for the Rams Hill Golf Course. But certainly there needs to be some more work done on this, but the representative monitoring site in the area is declining at a good pace, and I think it's something that the technical advisory committee should look into further.
Did they pull the well out of the model? Like
No,
considered it
it's
a
still
bad
being
data point?
monitored. There's a pressure transducer in that well that collects sub-daily data every 15 minutes. So we have, out of anywhere in the basin, probably Rams Hill has the most data available to analyze and review.
And so it still is in the model. So the model uses that data as part
Um,
of its calculation.
no, Rams Hill, those wells were drilled after the USGS developed the numerical model, so I don't believe that all the Rams Hill wells are actually in the model. But I would have to look into that.
Should they be?
Great.
Certainly, there are additional data points. There's site-specific aquifer properties that are calculated for some of those wells based on aquifer testing that they certainly could be incorporated in an update to the model.
Will that be an ask when you're updating? I mean, would that be something that would be requested when you're updating the model?
Yeah, in terms of like the basin-wide water budget and determination of sustainable yield, it's probably not a huge issue, but when we get into localized management of water resources, kind of getting down to the management areas, being the south, central, and north, that it may be pertinent to update those wells in the model to better understand the zone budget or the water budget for that area of the basin.
Right.
One thing to consider is that those wells are pumping non-potable water. They're pumping water that has arsenic above the drinking water standard. So from a water quality optimization standpoint, it's probably better to pump non-potable water for a golf course than have them pump elsewhere in the basin potable water. So it does get in kind of into these project and management actions and how you want to optimize management of the basin. I think from the water district standpoint, that it's probably better for them to pump non-potable water than potable water that the district wants to serve its customers. But in terms of managing groundwater levels, I think it's something that the TAC needs to look at a little bit more closely.
And Trey, when you say a confined well, or I don't remember the term that Andy used the other night, how does that, it's part of the overall aquifer, but it's sort of walled off somehow geologically, or what is that? Can you tell us a little bit more how that's defined?
Sure. So the difference between a confined and unconfined aquifer is that an unconfined aquifer is essentially a water table aquifer and can freely communicate with the air, or if it's connected to a stream nearby, it can interact. But a confined aquifer occurs in groundwater basins, typically when you have very thick clay layers. So for instance, in the Central Valley, you get what's known as the Corcoran clay, which is over 100 feet thick in places, and the water beneath that layer is confined in that it's under pressure. And what happens when the difference between pumping a confined aquifer and an unconfined aquifer is that when you pump an unconfined aquifer, you see a drainage of the aquifer material. It actually will dewater. But when you have a confined aquifer, you're essentially just depressurizing that aquifer. It's still fully saturated. So there's still water in all the pore space. But what makes it more complicated in Borrego, and it's conceptually a little bit challenging to understand, is that because we don't have these vast, continuous, extensive clay layers, it's really this depositional environment where it's been high energy, low energy. You get interbedding of the sediments where you get sand, clay, and silt that's on the order of a couple feet thick, that you get this phenomenon, which is a confining downward condition. So as you get deeper in the basin, you get these areas that act or behave as they're confined, yet you can get leakage from above through the sediments to recharge the layers below. And that's what you see at Rams Hill Golf Course. And this is very clear in the pumping recovery data that, as John and others have mentioned, some of those water level declines are on the order of hundreds of feet. But if you turn those wells off, they will recover for months and months at a time, just slowly. So it's basically the overlying water from the aquifers above slowly leak and percolate down into the area where the pumping occurred. So in terms of having a static groundwater level, it's a little bit tricky what the actual static groundwater level is in that area of the basin, because it will continue to recover for months at a time before you get kind of close to a static groundwater level. Whereas in other portions of the basin in the North Management area, you turn off a well, and probably if you take a water level within 20 minutes, a half an hour, you're probably already back to static groundwater levels. So it just kind of skews where we're at, but this is where you can use models and other data to better understand what the sustainable yield is for portions of the management areas. I hope that wasn't too technical.
No, that was very helpful, actually. Thank you, Trey. Appreciate that.
So
Go ahead, Diane.
Thanks. I just want to be sure that my recollection is right, Trey, that there isn't necessarily a bad effect of the South Management area getting dewatered because for BWD at least, because BWD is not pumping down there, right? It's not affecting the rest of the aquifer that one is going down.
That's correct, Diane. The only well that it's impacting is the district's ID18, which is in the South Management area. The district typically uses that as a backup well. It does use it at times though. So that is really the only well the pumping at Rams Hill is impacting.
Thanks. That's not the Wilcox well though, right?
No, it's Improvement District Well 8.
8. Okay. I'll look it up. Thank you.
Tammy.
So Trey, thanks for being here today. Andy was asserting that the South Management area, I have two questions. The first one is, South Management area is a confined aquifer, which is different than what you're saying. Let's say he's right. It is a confined aquifer. What does that mean?
The same thing.
Yeah, I think it just gets back to what is the static groundwater level, and how long do you have to let these wells recover until you really understand where we are at in terms of static levels. Confined, semi-confined, they're fairly close technically, but based on the aquifer testing that we have done down there, including for aquifer testing that was performed on the district's well ID18, it appears that aquifer is in fact likely semi-confined. It just means that it behaves a little bit differently than some of the other wells, like in the North Management Area and Central Management Area. We do see confining downward conditions in those areas of the basin as well, but we're likely just pumping in the South Management Area more from the lower aquifer, which is just a little bit different than some other areas of the basin.
So is it fair to say that the difference between confined and semi-confined is just time to reach static level?
That would be a good comparison between confined and unconfined. With the semi-confined, you do get leakage from above, which is causing this kind of delayed recovery of groundwater levels over time.
Well, wait, but in confined, confined will.
You will. It depends on the confined system, but a confined system can also take sometimes longer to recover as well.
Okay, so thanks. The second question is, I have heard about north, south, central management areas, and that didn't mean anything to me until this conversation. Are we expected as part of Sigma and the GMP to manage these three management areas separately? Like, why do we have three management areas? What is the significance of that?
Right, those management areas, especially the distinction between the South Management Area and the Central Management Area, are that they aren't strongly hydraulically connected. So when you pump in the South Management Area, you're really not causing much in the way of groundwater decline in the Central Management Area, and vice versa. They are almost, you could think of them as somewhat isolated, whereas it's pretty clear that the North Management Area and the Central Management Area have strong hydraulic connection, that if you pump in the north, it's going to impact water levels in the central. The management areas were also developed based on the existing land use. So the North Management Area is predominantly agricultural pumping, whereas the Central Management Area is domestic and municipal pumping with some ag. So it was a way of understanding that if you cut pumping in the North Management Area and achieve sustainable yield by 2040, if you keep the pumping rate the same in the South Management Area over that time, you still could have potential undesirable results, because the South Management Area is not well connected with the Central and North Management Areas. So you're seeing that already to some extent, where groundwater levels continue to decline in the South Management Area, and if you continue to pump at the current rate of extraction, you will see a continued decline in groundwater levels. I should say this is not necessarily anything new. This was identified in the 80s and 90s when the golf course initially came into operation. They didn't have Rams Hill wells 3, 4, 5, and 6 at that time. They elected to pump from the Central Management Area and wheel the water through the district's pipelines to irrigate the golf course. And once they started pumping from the Central Management Area, the groundwater levels in the South Management Area recovered, and likely recovered due to over irrigation of the golf course and return flows that got into the South Management Area. So it's a phenomenon that we've already experienced, and it's something that has been pretty well understood, I think, for over a decade, that the South Management Area on its own likely cannot sustain production for the golf course.
So what does that mean in terms of trying to manage the basin? That's the question, which we can't answer right now, I guess.
Yeah,
But
I think you look at it from multiple fronts. One is you're managing both groundwater levels, but second, you're also managing water quality. So you have to make some sort of optimization analysis in terms of, are you okay with letting groundwater levels decline more in the south management area because they're using non-potable water? And are there other undesirable results, such as impacts to subsidence or other sustainability indicators that you trigger by allowing groundwater levels to decline in the south management area? So I think it's a good technical question that should be considered, but I don't know that there's the right answer.
it's going to be a policy decision, basically, huh? Maybe more than technical. I'd like to circle back to the annual report when the time is right, please. Okay, shall I go now? Um, I meant to ask you, Trey, the monitoring, I think it was the quality monitoring specifically, they were unable to access a couple of wells, and then another one had no electricity or something. I thought that was, and they just seemed to say, oh well, and reported even less data than we would have had otherwise. What do you think about that, Trey?
Yeah, a few of the wells were district wells that have pulled pumps and are no longer operational, and those will be now groundwater level monitoring wells and likely no longer sampled for water quality. And then there were a couple other wells where there are access issues or no power. It's typical for that to happen sometimes during a mobilization. In particular, not for water quality, but for groundwater levels, they couldn't get out to the sink to monitor MW5 A and B. So I guess there just has to be maybe some contingency that if certain things don't get done during the sampling event, whether or not it's fine to just wait to the following sampling event in the next season, or if there should be a separate mobilization to go out and collect the data. Obviously, the Water Master Board, is very cost conscious, so I think that they would tend to defer the sampling or data collection to the next event from a cost standpoint. But it's pretty typical when you're monitoring, 50 wells for groundwater levels and 30 some odd wells for water quality, for there to be logistical issues for collecting data.
It seems like it's a question, though, as to whether BWD should raise a stink, whether with the water master and say, look, sorry, it costs money, but we think it's important to capture these wells. I haven't looked at it at the report again in the last week, I think, but it seemed to me one of those wells was in a place where we would really miss having the data. But yeah.
Yeah, one recommendation I did have in the groundwater plan was that I thought it was advisable for the water master to collect the groundwater levels from all the representative monitoring sites. I think BWD staff might be doing a few, but those data are fairly important for the updates to the annual report, the numerical model, and that we should have some consistency. Those are the sites that you're using to essentially make management decisions. So I think those sites should be monitored at the same time and by the same entities. So that might be one discussion to have with Water Master staff, is that they at least for all the representative monitoring sites in the plan, that they actually collect the data.
What do the other directors think about that?
Am I right, Trey, that you just said that BWD does not report groundwater level data at our BWD wells?
No, most of the BWD wells now have pressure transducers installed that collect sub-daily data and that can be downloaded. So they are collecting the data. It's just that sometimes it doesn't happen at the exact same time as they're doing their work. And there are different folks doing it. So it may make sense to have water master staff, in particular for the representative monitoring site wells, go to those wells with BWD staff and have them collect the data and make sure that it's done at the same time interval. But we certainly can talk this through with water master staff.
So are we talking about them trying again on the wells that they missed, just for not to do with the annual report necessarily, but for us to have a good chain of data?
Some of those wells, I believe, are going to be removed from the network and
Right,
hopefully
right.
replaced with new wells. The district has removed pumps and motors from some wells, so they no longer can sample them at the wellhead, but you could put in a temporary pump and sample it. So that's something to discuss with the water master in terms of when they decide to remove a well from the monitoring network for water quality purposes. What is the process that is taken to do that? At this point, it seems to be done at their under their independent judgment, but there isn't really a formal process to add or subtract wells from the monitoring network.
Seems like there should be.
Yeah, that's a great comment for the monitoring plan, is that it should be more formalized when wells are added and subtracted, for especially if it's just for groundwater quality, that there should be a process to do that.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, would that be a thing for you to do, Trey, or Jeff, or both of you? How are you working? How are you dividing that stuff up?
We can add that as a comment to the groundwater monitoring plan, and talk that through the TAC process and see what water master staff says about it. But we can also review the wells that have been removed from the groundwater monitoring and look at it in a little more detail and see if whether the district thinks that those are good wells to continue to monitor.
Okay.
I
And
think we should do both.
And Trey, it sounds like BWD saying, okay, we'll just monitor our own darn wells and not have to fight with the water master over the cost. It sounds like you're saying it should be the same people, or at least exactly the same techniques that are used time after time. So it wouldn't work to get BWD to monitor its own.
No, I think it's fine for, as long as BWD staff are familiar with the methods and procedures to monitor groundwater levels and water quality, which, they are to some extent, that it's fine for Borrego Water District staff to monitor them. I think there could just be a little bit better coordination on when they're monitored, and, to avoid especially data gaps for the representative monitoring sites. I think it'd be worthwhile for at least the groundwater levels for the ground water master staff to collect those and confirm they're accurate, because they're relying on those for management actions and reporting and for updating models. So I think it's important that those sites are well documented.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so I think, Diane, the point here is the water master needs to officially accept the data from the BWD wells by whatever process, Trace sort of describing some process things, but whatever the process is that they require, that they accept them into the network, their data network.
Right.
Yeah, and Trey, we had a discussion. I can't remember if you were on the call at the time when we abandoned a well. We BWD abandoned a well and decided that we would not use it as a water quality monitoring well because we felt that there was another well close enough by. But it would be much better to have the water master agree with that decision that we didn't need this particular data point because we had one that was close enough. It wasn't adding anything. So I know at least for one of our wells that we abandoned, we did discuss whether we keep it as water quality and said we didn't need to. I don't know if we conferred with you, but whether we did or didn't, I do think that it would be best to have the water master involved in us pulling out a water quality monitoring well or adding them or just owning those, or at least being part and ultimately owning the decisions and accepting the data into their model. And it would be
Yeah, I
good,
think
Trey, for you to take a look at what we did and let us know whether we were right when we abandoned the water quality aspect of this well, because there's one close enough, or maybe we should have left it in, or maybe we should do something different. So I think that's a good piece of work for you to look into, assuming the other directors and Jeff agree.
okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Is Esmeralda on? I have a few slides to share regarding groundwater levels in the sink, if I can get share screen access.
There you go.
Let's see.
And Madam President, while Trey's doing that, there is a fair amount of communications between water master staff and BWD staff on specific protocols for groundwater elevations. I just don't scour each email to get into all the details, but even as recent as a week or two ago, water master staff and BWD are still communicating about how to coordinate and how to best use the data that we generate. So I don't want to leave the impression that we're just on two islands out there floating and we never talk to each other and one hand doesn't know, well, I guess we're not the same hand, but one agency doesn't know what the other one's doing. Is it perfect yet? No. But there is still constant communication amongst the staff about making sure that we are on the same page.
Trey,
Good,
can you make that full screen, your slide?
Let me see. It's not full screen. Are you seeing my slide notes?
I'm seeing
yeah.
your slide notes, but everything's small on my computer. I just didn't know if the picture could be fuller.
Uh-oh.
That's okay if
Did
it
that
can't.
work?
No, it's still small, but that's okay. Go.
Yeah,
Kathy,
it's sharing a different screen.
Kathy, on my screen, I can use the wheel on my mouse to zoom in, and then there's the plus minus on the right side of the screen, which will also zoom
Yeah.
in. But,
Okay.
it can get bigger, I guess, because I have the same issue. But
Okay.
I
Thank
can
you.
zoom in.
Yeah, I apologize. It keeps on sharing my other smaller screen and not my big screen. I'm not quite sure why.
That's all right. Jeff made a good suggestion that helps
Okay.
to see it. So go forward.
Thank you, President Dice. I just wanted to provide the board an update regarding our best available data for groundwater levels in and around the Borrego sink and the historical extent of the mesquite bosque habitat. As you're aware, there are two ongoing studies, one by Land IQ and the other by UCI, and they're starting to make some interpolations on depth to groundwater in this area and what data was used. And I thought it would be good to do an overview just so there's a good understanding of the data available. So in the sink, there are 3 wells referred to as sink 12G1, sink 7N1, and the district's MW5A, 5B. Sink 7N1 extends back to 1953, and the data went until about the mid 60s, and then finally, when the well was measured in the 2000s, it was dry. So we just don't have one singular well with a long-term record of groundwater levels. But what we can do is interpolate the trend over time between the different wells. And the nice thing that we have is Sync 12G1 does have some of that historical data in the 1960s. And before it went dry around 2008, we were able to get a groundwater, or DWR was able to get a groundwater level out of that well. And if you look at the projected trend, which are the dotted blue and orange lines, they match up nicely over time for this linear trend of groundwater decline, which is about, on average, 0.7 feet per year of decline from 1953 to present. So the current groundwater level at MW5B is about 57.4 feet below ground surface. So the decline over the 69 years from 1953 to 2022 in this area of the sink has been about 47 feet. One other thing we did recently was just look at depth of groundwater in the vicinity of the Borrego sink. It ranges from 22.95 feet at wastewater treatment plant 1 to 126 feet at the Borrego landfill. And I should really emphasize that the groundwater level at the wastewater treatment plant is influenced by recharge at Rams Hill wastewater percolation ponds. We have a pressure transducer in that well. We see clear response to groundwater levels when effluent is discharged to the ponds. The nearest well to that is MW3. It's about 1,400 feet away, and at that well, the depth of water is 72 feet. So there's a fairly good mounding of groundwater that occurs in the vicinity of the percolation ponds, and it's certainly not representative of the current depth of groundwater in the sink as it's artificially recharged. I just wanted to provide just some general understanding of what we think groundwater levels are at right now in the regional groundwater table. At MW5A, 5B, it's currently about 58 feet below ground surface, and that's measured. If you interpolate the data from the rate of decline that we're continuing to see, about 0.7 feet per year, back to the sink wells, 12G and 7N1, the regional groundwater table is likely at 75 feet at sink 7N1, 80 feet at sink 12G1. There's about 5 wells, actually I think it's 6 wells at the Borrego landfill. All of those wells have a groundwater table of greater than or 100 feet below ground surface. It looks like my airport well got cut off here, but that is currently at about 117 feet below ground surface. The county yard is at about 107 feet below ground surface. And if you see here to the south, you can actually see the percolation pond. At that location in that general vicinity, the depth of groundwater is about 20 feet, but obviously as you get further away from the recharge and the mounding that occurs there, the depth of groundwater is going to increase. This is just a little hydrogeological conceptual model that was developed as part of the GSP. You can see that the current regional groundwater table in many instances is greater than 50 feet, upwards of 100 feet in the vicinity of the Borrego sink. That said, it's very fine sediment in the sink. This has been documented by well logs. There is potential for sand layers to be perched in the sink, so that is something that's not well understood. But I think there is pretty good data to support that groundwater levels in the sink typically are in excess of 50 feet, and in many instances are approaching 100 feet, and we're seeing a rate of decline of about 0.7 feet per year. With that, I'll take any questions.
And one of the things that this is relevant to is the GDE study, right?
Right. There's been some, I think, misunderstanding of depth of groundwater. There's been a document that's put forward that the depth of groundwater in the sink is 15 feet below ground surface, based on some interpolation that was done of groundwater contours. I'm not quite sure how that was done, but if you look at the measured data, there does not appear to be measured data that supports a depth of groundwater anywhere in the basin of 15 feet below ground surface. The only area that comes close is the percolation pond at the wastewater treatment plant, and there's a continual source of recharge at that location that sustains a mound of groundwater in the vicinity of those ponds, and you have an artificially high groundwater level at that location. That said, there is some uncertainty regarding the groundwater depth in areas of the sink. There's a lot of areas where there are not wells located. The wells are typically drilled deeper because they were drilled for production. So there is potential for perched groundwater to be above those clay layers, and they may sustain groundwater dependent ecosystems. But based on the data we have available, the depth of groundwater in the regional water table is greater than 50 feet in most areas of the sink and the historical extent of the Mesquite Bosque.
Could that LIDAR work that DWR is funding elsewhere in the state, would that show perched aquifers?
LIDAR is typically going to be used to develop or inform the topography or a digital elevation model. That is one issue I think that occurred with the data interpolation, is that there isn't terrific elevation data for the basin. So if you're subtracting incorrect surface elevation from the interpolated groundwater elevation, then you can get an an offset in where the depth of water is. But typically you needed to do some sort of surface geophysics if you weren't doing monitoring wells to determine the depth to groundwater.
And does LIDAR do surface geophysics? It does
No,
subsurface.
it's a light detection method that is typically only going to give you the ground surface. There are resistivity, time domain, electromagnetic resistivity, and other methods that you can do to interpolate the depth of groundwater, and it may be a recommendation for some of the ongoing studies if they can't permit or afford monitoring wells, that they could do some surface geophysics to better understand whether there are any perched lenses of water in the Borrego sink and better understand where the regional depth to water occurs in the basin in areas where we don't have wells.
Mm.
Is there something notable about the difference between fine sediment and coarse sediment?
Right. So the sink, you've got a high energy depositional environment with flood flows coming off of the mountains, and over time, you get higher velocity closer to the mountain front. So you get deposition of the coarser material. And as those flows settle over time and eventually make it down the sink, that's very low energy. So that's where you typically get the fine grained material to deposit. And the difference is that those finer grained sediments, that's what forms those confining layers. And that's why you get below those systems, you can get the semi-confined and confined conditions. But you also tend to get these little lenses of coarse material that may have washed out during a super flood event. And when those layers become surrounded by the finer materials, it lends itself for the potential for like a perched water table above the regional water table. And that may sustain, you may get these elevated lenses of higher water that may sustain ecosystems during drier periods. But there certainly isn't the resolution with the monitoring network we have to find those areas. And it's hypothesized, but there's a lot of uncertainty whether there is any perched groundwater in the basin.
So I have a friend at the Air Ranch said that their well has not declined at all over 20 years. Is that true?
Their
I assume that
groundwater levels are fairly stable over time. We did monitor their water levels as part of some work that was done for Rams Hill. They don't use that much water, and their water levels are fairly stable. They're not. There's some upfolding of the basin that occurs in that area and kind of near Sleepy Hollow, and there's some faulting that goes through there. So they may be not even connected to the South Management Area, but that's just a hypothesis. But it does not appear that pumping from Rams Hill, for instance, impacts or propagates over towards the Air Ranch based on the first several years of data monitoring. I haven't looked at those groundwater levels recently, but when we were monitoring them with pressure transducers, they were very stable.
and they're also far enough from the sink that the I don't know, decline in the groundwater table isn't affecting them either.
Again, yeah, I speculate there's some faulting that runs through that area of the basin, and there's some discontinuity in the sediment facies. But I do suspect that the Air Ranch isn't well hydraulically connected in the subsurface to the south management area and other areas of the basin.
I didn't see your slide 3 go by. Did you mean to show it?
Let me see.
You're on slide 5 now?
Yeah, slide 3 was just a summary of wells in the vicinity of the sink and the depth of water. I do need to get some updated data from the water master for some of these wells, but it really was just this summary that based on all the available data we have, groundwater levels range from about 23 to 126 feet below ground surface, and that most of the water levels are in excess of 50 feet, most approaching close to 100 feet, and they're just at this time there isn't measured data or empirical information that supports a depth of groundwater that would be anywhere close to 15 feet below ground surface in this area of the basin. So I think that was just important to emphasize. That was a finding of one of the studies, that there was a suggestion that the depth of groundwater in this area is 15 feet, and technically I'm just not seeing that based on the available data.
Hey, Trey, to me, there's one other important variable in this whole GDE analysis, and that is, how deep the tap roots can go. And I kind of remember the numbers from when we talked about this back in the GSP days, but was it like 80 feet or something, 85 feet or something? What was the longest known tap root or something in the Mesquite Bosque? Because there's also that data that's important in terms of, can a mesquite plant survive when groundwater elevations are 126 feet below surface? Do you remember what
Right.
that was?
Yeah, I mean there's been documentation of tamarisk, going down hundreds of feet. The conceptual model that was originally developed for Appendix D4 had some citation of about 15 feet in the sink, and UCI has located some more recent studies that suggest it's more on the order of 37 or 38 feet. So I think that data is accurate. I think it does need to be updated. Certainly, there's a likelihood that why you're seeing mesquite sustain in these areas is that their rooting depths are likely a lot deeper than what was originally conceptualized in the basin. I think that work is solid, and I think it's probably likely that a lot of these plants have adapted over time to grow deeper roots and chase the water down as it's declining at 0.7 feet per year in the basin. So I wouldn't be surprised if you end up seeing even deeper rooting depths potentially. The trees have trained themselves to chase the water down as they can. It's a pretty stable rate of decline, 0.7 feet per year. It seems that the plants could grow roots at that rate. Often what you see in other basins is that groundwater levels drop so precipitously, say like 20 feet in a year, and the plants just can't adjust. Like they just can't grow their roots that quickly. So they just immediately die off. But I think there's good work going on. I just want to make sure that we're using best available data. And, right now, I think there's just a lot of uncertainty as to whether there's potentially perched water in the sink that may be sustaining some of this habitat. And in my recommendation and would be to probably do some surface geophysics to run some lines around here where they have if they find vegetation with good health that you could run lines along those areas and investigate the depth of groundwater. And there may be a perched aquifer. It's a little uncertain, but the data we have as far as the regional aquifer goes is that it's greater than 50 feet in the area of the sink and approaching 100 feet and dropping every year at about 0.7 feet per year.
Excellent. And then I guess a lot of these issues will be analyzed at great depth as part of the Prop 68 grant, right? The UCI project. That's kind of the point of all this, right? They're going to carbon date the water in the leaves or something to figure out how old the water is, to see, you know, where the water came from. And they're going to, I guess, employ some fairly sophisticated or unique techniques that haven't been used out here before to help hopefully address and to answer some of these questions, right? Isn't that kind of the point?
So
I will answer
before
my
this,
question. Yes, it is. It is the point. Yeah. So I think that kind of, Diane, getting back to what do we do about it? I think we'll monitor this project very closely. David Garman and Travis are very willing and eager to share as much information as possible. Some audiences aren't as willing as others. I think we're a very willing and appreciative audience. So I know as David and I and Travis were talking about their project and all the other Prop 68 projects, you'll see some periodic check-ins from each one of these projects to this board, because I know David in particular wanted to make sure that our board is up to speed on what they're doing. So yeah, we'll definitely communicate closely with David and Travis and those folks. And thank you very much, Trey, for like looking at some of their initial work, because I think making sure they're starting from the right point is super, super important. It's not our project, it's not our job, but just to make sure they have the right data as the starting point. I think that's a good service that we're providing. So thanks for making sure they got the right info to start with.
so Jeff, I was looking before this meeting to see whether or not the judgment or the GMP requires the water master to investigate GDEs. I couldn't find it, but is the water master required to do something with respect to GDEs?
I don't know, Steve, Trey, I mean, how would you answer that? I mean, we evaluated it as part of the GMP. Go ahead, Trey.
I don't think there's anything in the judgment, but I think there might be something in the GMP, so I'd defer to Trey.
Sure. I mean, there were data gaps identified in the groundwater management plan related to GDEs, and there was some uncertainty regarding routing depth, uncertainty regarding whether there are any perched lenses in the sink, what some of the depth of groundwater might be in areas where there's sustained habitat. There also was a lack of site-specific field mapping of vegetation. So that there were data gaps identified. I think the way it was kind of left in the GD and in the GMP was that, you know, as funding becomes available, those data gaps would be filled. So I think the process that is being put forward now is filling those data gaps and would satisfy the requirement to further study groundwater dependent ecosystems.
Well, Trey, that's only if the water master accepts this data, and in the water master meeting, they declined the opportunity to review the data so far. So if the water master doesn't accept this UCI report, my question is, are they then obligated to do something on their own with respect to filling these data gaps?
Yeah, I think it gets to what actions would be required in terms of if GDEs were identified, you'd have to potentially manage them and develop minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in your plan to sustain those habitats. So I think that if there is additional data that becomes available that Water Master staff would need to review it and determine whether or not there's any sort of action or nexus with pumping in the basin that's and continuing to impair those habitats after January 1, 2015. It was kind of the conclusion of the GMP that a lot of the habitat had been desiccated prior to January 1st, 2015, which was the statutory deadline in SGMA, where if impacts were occurring after that date, then you had to address them. If the impacts occurred prior to the date, then SGMA didn't require you to address them. So that's probably an important point to make. And also in other basins where I've worked with groundwater dependent ecosystems, there has to be a nexus with the pumping. So the pumping that the district's doing, the pumping that the farmers and recreation folks are continuing to undertake in the basin, there has to be a nexus of that pumping with impairment of the habitat. Obviously, we're seeing a regional trend of groundwater decline. It seems to be propagating from some of these pumping centers. So I think you're already undertaking action to improve the condition, and that's through the demand reductions. And we've seen about 25 to 30% reduction already. Can't do a direct analysis since some of that initial pumping was estimated, but we're seeing substantial reductions even with the meter pumping. So that should improve over time your rate of decline. So that there is, through the judgment, you are taking action now that should result in improvement to that groundwater level trend that we were looking at earlier.
Tammy, I've been sort of scanning through the GMP while we've talked the last couple of minutes, and the language seems says that SGMA requires that all beneficial uses and users of groundwater, including groundwater dependent ecosystems, be considered in the GSPs. And this is something that I've been meaning to ask Steve about. I have this feeling that being considered is really not a very strong direction coming from the language of the GMP. It's like you can consider it and then say, oh well, and turn away.
Well, Diane, I don't think that's the full picture though, right? Because SGMA mandates that we avoid undesirable results to beneficial uses and users, right? And so if there are GDE and they are extant after January 1, 2015, we have to avoid causing, I mean, you can look at the regs to get the precise language, but you have to avoid causing significant injury kind of standard. It's up to the GSA and now the water master to determine what that significant and unreasonable injury would be. But no, it's not just about considering them and then saying, oh, we don't care about them. That doesn't meet the standard. But conversely, I mean, if there was relatively full desiccation before that date, there's no legal obligation to do anything to resurrect what was already gone. So I think part of the analysis that's going on with some of the Prop 68 subgrantees is to look at that issue a little more carefully. So there might be more information coming in the coming months and years on that and what was extant in 2015.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Good questions, everyone.
Thanks, Trey.
Thank you, Trey. Appreciate your time and your slides. That was always helpful. Jeff, did you
Yeah, Madam President, if you
have
don't
others?
mind, I'd like to rewind the tape a little bit and go back to the inflow discussion. Jim Bennett's ears were probably burning right around, what, 9:15 earlier today. Because I was talking about kind of the impact his comments had just in terms of my big takeaway from the last Water Master meeting. And so I saw Jim pop on, so maybe we can, since this is a kind of a Water Master only discussion today, why don't we just continue it if you all don't mind? And so, Jim, let me kind of paraphrase the discussion from earlier today. So Kathy was asking, hey, did anybody have any comments about the meeting? And I think some of the directors had theirs, and I went through and said, my comment really, and my takeaway really pertained to the comments made by Jim and the fact that we know very little about inflow, which I do remember that from our GMP days. And then maybe what was more, well, I don't want to say alarming, but more disheartening was the fact that if we, and this kind of made sense, that if we tried the same techniques used in the past, we would probably end up with similarly inaccurate data. And I don't know the exact words you used, but even if we tried new techniques, those would probably fail too. You didn't say it exactly that way, but it just seemed to be like, oh my gosh, how do we, and I'm thinking in my mind, how do we ever get a handle on inflows? And so just in the last couple of days, Steve and Trey and I were just chatting about what is the significance of inflows, and can we really manage a basin without knowing what the inflows are? And I always oversimplify sigma by saying, oh, sigma requires inflow minus outflow to be zero. And that's really not it. Inflow, it's not part of the mathematics. It's more of the undesirable results, which that's what Steve reminded me of, that we have to avoid the undesirable results. So I guess I'd love to get kind of your comments about the significance of inflows. Then it kind of gets back to the question that can we, from the sigma perspective and from a practical perspective, really effectively manage the basin without knowing what the inflows are? So maybe you could correct me on if I misinterpreted what you said, and then kind of what you're thinking, and kind of maybe some words of wisdom on which won't make me so worried about not knowing what the inflows are. So anyway, thanks, Jim. Good to see you. Hello again. So
Good
tell
morning.
us all about inflows. Yeah.
Y'all can hear me all right? Good. All right. Well, waking up to groundwater discussions is a good way to wake up. I appreciate all the work you guys are doing, and the fact that this basin is constantly being being monitored, both technically and community-wide. It's great. So just kind of going back to last Thursday, I think, Jeff, you were talking about, we had a task that Andy was having us consider, which was to basically look at different recharge methodologies as it relates to the subsurface and surface inflows into the basin. And Andy described that the USGS had basically has a fixed amount of underflow that it has coming into the basin every year, and that's not really what is happening in the system. And we all agree that's not what's happening in the system. And we want as accurate a model as possible. So some of my thoughts on Thursday were, when we did the GSP, the greatest uncertainty that we had in development of the GSP was the agricultural pumping. In terms of uncertainty with the model, it represented about 70% of the uncertainty that we actually have in the model accuracy. And one big step we're taking forward in reducing that uncertainty is we have pumping data now, so that we're able to take that 70% of the uncertainty out of the model. When we're talking about subsurface underflow and stream flow recharge, the USGS indicated stream recharge represents about 7% of the uncertainty, and the groundwater underflow 3%. And so taking those two different parameters, and we're talking about subsurface inflow, we're talking about all the mountains above the basin, all the areas that are they're feeding the basin, that are where you have subsurface flow coming into the basin, and then separately you have stream recharge along Coyote Creek, Borrego, Palm Canyon, and other tributaries that feed into the basin. And so when we look at subsurface inflow, we had a TAC discussion back in April of 2021 on this issue, where a conclusion was made by the TAC at that point that unfortunately there are a few wells along the boundary of the basin to really compare subsurface inflow with the actual groundwater levels in the basin. And Andy's proposal was to evaluate the groundwater levels at the fringe of the basin with the actual water that's coming into the basin. And he was postulating that some years you get a whole lot more subsurface inflow than others. It's not a static amount that's coming in. Our problem is that the groundwater levels that are along the fringe of the basin, we have few, and the wells where we do measure it show groundwater levels dropping year after year after year. There's nothing to really calibrate to. So we can chase recharge methods all we want in terms of trying to take that 3% of the uncertainty out of the model. We'll have different methodologies, but if it's data, actual groundwater level data, it's very difficult when you're talking about this huge area that's feeding into the basin. So the way it was designed by the USGS was sort of a fixed function because they had no other real way to validate using any other methods. And my concern is that if we start chasing other methods, we're just chasing the same uncertainty in terms of not having the data. And on the surface flow, stream gauges are really limited and sporadic, and we've had a lot of difficulty in maintaining them, especially on the Coyote Creek. And Dudek's conclusion in the actual GSP was to get more surface flow monitoring into, so that we're able to better understand the surface recharge that's occurring along the, and to reduce uncertainty. We've got grant money for that, and I think we need to continue to look for opportunities to better understand surface flow coming into the basin. Again, if we're chasing recharge methodologies to better better accurately produce a number for the model, we need data is what, ultimately. And Jeff, as far as your question, it's a 10% of the uncertainty of the model, the subsurface and the surface flows that are coming into the basin. We're able to manage the basin because we have groundwater data otherwise that is able to be used, and especially groundwater levels over time, the actual elevations. We have you guys were having some of that discussion today, even that there are levels where there are minimum thresholds set in the actual individual areas throughout all three of the management areas that were part of the GMP. And we're able to course correct if we're seeing localized impacts. And that's one of the good things about the South Management Area, where we're seeing MW3 having levels dropping. My question to Andy was, what does this mean, and what are we going to do about it? And that's something that Trey had just recommended here for TAC discussion, is like, what are we going to do with the South Management Area where we see localized drawdown? That 5,700 acre foot number is kind of a holistic number for the whole basin, and then we get more fine-tuned when we get into the groundwater elevations, and that's how we're managing the basin, along with groundwater quality data in which to look at trends of groundwater quality over time and seeing if there are any detrimental effects from the actual groundwater use in the basin as we continue through time. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. And
thank you so much. See, I told you I left a lot out, Kathy. Yeah. No, thank you, Jim. That was really useful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Any questions for Jim from the board? I'll let you take over, Kathy.
Well, I think we've covered quite a bit of ground here on the Water Master meeting of last week, and we all have looked at the annual report. We think it's an improvement over last year, and well done. We've got a report from Trey on the update for the hydrological model. Is there anything else that anybody would like to ask while we have Jim and Trey here about the Water Master annual report, the hydrologic model. I think we've covered a lot of ground for this week, for this meeting. So last chance. Any comments from the public as well?
Can I just ask Steve to confirm that this Friday is the annual status conference? Did I hear that right?
I believe that's right. Let me double check.
Yeah, I think it was the 17th.
Yes, it's Friday.
Okay. Do we need a new link for that? Do those call-in numbers change?
Not for the public line. My understanding is the number never changes for the public line.
Have to find
Okay.
it again.
I don't think it's going to be a whole lot of fireworks, but help yourself to attend if you'd like.
Darn. Okay. Everyone was behaving better. So, I think this means that we can move on to the section 3 board committee reports if needed. Are there any standing or ad hoc committee reports?
I have a quick question, if you don't mind, from the public.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and
Sorry, I
you'll
didn't
off.
see your hand.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Bob.
it
Okay, go
just
ahead.
went up. That's quite all right. Yeah, for Trey and Jim, I'm curious to know to what extent, if at all, the water needs of the animal population, the critter population in the zone are considered when factoring the use of the water and, for habitat as well, maintaining habitat for these critters and places where they can drink or anything like that.
Yeah, Bob, I can say that in terms of wildlife, there wasn't in the water budget a specific demand allocated for that. But I think it's fairly well known that the wildlife opportunistically takes advantage of the irrigation that's occurring within the basin to access water, and that when you get outside of the groundwater basin in the watershed, they're in the higher elevations. There's multiple springs that bighorn sheep and other wildlife access for water supply. Um, and then in terms of the water budget, there was an allocation or a consumptive use of water demand or evapotranspiration for phreatophytes or native vegetation that's in the model. I don't have that number right in front of me, but pre-development, it was over 6,000 acre feet. And then as the groundwater level declined, as we were showing earlier in the meeting, much of that vegetation desiccated and was being applied to the agricultural fields. And over time, the amount of water consumptively used by native vegetation in the basin has declined precipitously. But there is still currently an estimate of evapotranspiration by native plants in the basin, and that is in the water budget.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Going to section 3. Board committee reports. Anybody have anything on our standing or ad hoc committees? Tammy.
Just a quick update on cybersecurity. About half a year ago, the government group CISA came in and did an evaluation, if you remember, of all of our security procedures and protocols, came up with recommendations. We just did a review roughly at the 6-month point of what we've implemented. And I can report that of their recommendations, 70% of them have been fully implemented, or I guess fully mitigated is their terminology. 10% has been partially mitigated. One we haven't addressed yet, or sorry, 10% we haven't addressed yet, and 10% of them we accepted the risk and are not going to do anything. And just on that last 10%, the significant portion of those were around phishing attacks and spam, and the resulting danger of subsiding, of actually doing a phishing attack and clicking on the link you shouldn't click. And we've reached a balance where it's a balance of tightening down all the filtering systems to try to block phishing out. But if you tighten them too much, then you don't let legitimate emails in. And so we've gotten them tightened down to the level we think is reasonable, and then coupled that with ongoing employee training of just ever awareness of think before you click, look at the various elements of email messages. Does it seem too good to be true? Particularly spear phishing, and that's where the message looks like it's coming from a legit person, somebody who you know, an organization that you know, targeted to you. Just be careful and conscious with email. It's become a dangerous tool. So we decided with the level of tightening and filtration we have with the various systems that filter out spam and phishing attacks, coupled with just awareness training, that we've accepted the sort of level of risk that they identified. So takeaway, good news, we've made significant progress on, 80% almost, and we have like 10, 15% of the work left to do. So all in all, hats off to CISA for coming in and spending a week here in Borrego and digging into this stuff, and hats off to our team here for addressing what they came up with and mitigating them.
Well, thanks, Tammy, for all your work. I believe the committee is a party of one, but for now. But
now that Paul left, yes.
Yeah. So appreciate all your work, and I love the terminology they come up with. Spear phishing, really. That's good. Any other reports for the ad hocs? So work is ongoing, and hearing no other reports, we'll go down to section 4, the staff reports. Diana, do you have an administrative report for us today?
Good morning. Yes, I do.
Hi.
Hi. It's just some information, really. I just wanted to make you aware of some boundary adjustments that is going on. And this is regarding the Charlie White property. So just a brief history on this property, how we acquired it. Going back to 2005, the district purchased a 1-acre parcel from the Cavalli family, and that is where well 4 is now. This well 4 is located near Borrego Springs Road and Bighorn Road. So in 2015, Charlie White, who owned basically that portion of that corner, it was 170 acres. He donated 22.5 acres of land to the BWD. And this particular donated land horseshoes around the 1-acre parcel previously purchased by BWD back in 2005. So the district fenced off a portion of those 22 acres and developed what is now well 9. So the fenced acreage is about 10 acres. Now, last year, Mr. White was looking into the possibility of building a home, developing the property, and after he contacted the county and many back and forth phone calls, he discovered that the lots were not legal parcels and he could not obtain a building permit. So he had contacted us. We thought, well, our end was done, but apparently some formal paperwork still needed to happen. So the solution is a boundary adjustment with a certificate of compliance needs to be completed and sent to the county for recording, which then that should make legal lots and he's able to apply for a building permit. Okay, so we know that needs to happen. And so Mr. White had asked us if the BWD needed the entire 22 acres that was donated or just the fenced area. And so the fenced area is the 10 acres horseshoeing around the 1 acre parcel. So then after speaking with Alan and Jeff, it was agreed that the district only needed the fenced area. So the Kappa Surveying is going to be doing the surveying to do the move the boundary lines and complete the boundary adjustment, pass it on to the county so we can make it legal lots. So just wanted to give you that information about what's going on. I know it's kind of a lot of picturing in your head what's going on, but yeah, that was all I have. I have not yet heard back from Mr. White or from Kappa Surveying to see how the work went back in January, but that is where we are at now.
So we're giving donated land back. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And it turns out that Mr. White, I think, sitting here today does intend to develop. And so even we had a piece like these 22 acres was just really big. And it included a piece that was like on the other side of some tamarisk trees that we physically couldn't even get to. And that kind of naturally created a driveway to his adjoining parcels. And then we have the 10 acres that are fenced in now is surrounding our new well, well 4-9. This is, we have well 4-4 that was right next door, that 1 acre piece that Diana was talking about. Then we located well 4-9 within the 22 acres, but will now be 10 acres once we do the boundary adjustment for the land donation. And so we have everything we need. Even if we do solar out there someday, there is plenty of room to do solar within that existing 10 acre fenced in perimeter. There are no neighbors. Nobody's going to complain about the unsightliness of the barbed wire and the chain link fence. So we're happy with the 10 acres we have. And just to have extra land just doesn't do us any good. It's just more liability. And like I said, there were some existing impediments on this property, big tamarisk trees. You know how big they get? 200-foot tall tamarisk trees that we really don't need. And so anyway, thank you, Diana, for explaining it. But long story short, we will end up back with our 10 acres, and then we will give back some of Mr. White's land back to him. And then he really does plan to build. He had some really interesting ideas about some equestrian opportunities out there. And I guess there's a long history about Kentucky Derby winners that used to be housed, and that's not the right word, that used to be kept out there on a ranch back in the day. So there's a long equestrian history to that parcel. Mr. White himself is all about horses. So yeah, he has some interesting ideas about some of his buddies buying the lots around him and having some sort of kind of joint use equestrian. And maybe even, kind of a serious equestrian facility out there to try to, I won't say compete, but to offer some alternatives to, he said there was a really nice one somewhere in El Centro or maybe closer to Indio somewhere, but there was a real nice equestrian facility somewhere that really is great for the local community, and he can see some of that kind of spilling over into Borrego. So Diane and I spent an interesting afternoon with Mr. White hearing about his plans and the history, and how horses in Borrego, how our paths crossed back in the day. So it's really fascinating. But the good news is we'll end up with what we need. Anything outside the fence, we don't want the liability for it. Doesn't do us any good. We can't even physically access it due to the way these trees were installed back in the day. So I think we're happy. And then, yeah, poor Mr. White couldn't do anything with his land after he donated it to us. Getting all this cleaned up for him would be great. But we'll come back in the future with the actual items. You know, I'm sure there might be a resolution or an easement document or something that's associated with this. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. You got a little garbled there in the end, but when you come back with it, can we have pictures or a map? So
Yeah,
that'd be great. I'm picturing it, but I bet it looks different.
I understand.
Thank you, Diane.
Question?
Yes, go ahead.
Does any money need to change hands? Do they need to pay us for it, or does any money need to
They don't.
change hands as part of this?
Nope. They're covering all the costs associated with it, since we're doing this to help out Mr. White. So right, Dan, no cost.
Madam President, I'm very sorry to interrupt. Jeff, can we talk about that before we finalize the transaction, just so I'm
Oh, yeah, we're just
what's
starting.
going
We're
on?
just starting
Thank
the
you.
transaction.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
It's always good to have counsel. Okay. Thank you, Diana. Appreciate the report. That's kind of an interesting project you're working on there.
Yes, it is.
And it looks like it's Jeff's turn here on our agenda.
Let's talk about grants, if you don't mind. Let's see. So, okay, we'll just start at the top. So on the replacement of our water tanks and the Wilcox emergency motor, we are still waiting for the final agreement from DWR that will handle the approximately $800,000 in increased cost between the original engineer's estimate and the final bid amounts. Once again, all indications from the staff going way back, almost a year ago, were that these extra costs would be covered. However, there is a process that DWR goes through to authorize those additional costs. And so we are still waiting. I'm waiting every day, checking my emails to see and wait for the good news to come back and that the additional funds have been approved for our water tank replacement grant. And then I think Alan reported the construction's going great, and we're actually half the one of the twins is gone, the twin tanks.
Yeah.
And so let's see, the next grant would be, the Prop 68 stuff. Thank you, Tammy, Jessica, David Dale, and others for working on our AMI, automated meter reading infrastructure proposal. We should have a request for proposal document ready here in the next few weeks, and hopefully start selecting the vendor and getting that project going. And then thank you to Jessica for helping me coordinate with all the Prop 68 sub-grantees. Been quite a bit of work in just making sure, and the committee, thank you, Tammy and Diane, for joining on a call or two with the various sub-grantees. We're just making sure that everybody's fully informed on what's required, and we're all just, and I think everybody is ready to go, and I think everybody's fully informed on what's needed. We sent out a little reminder email to the sub-grantees about they need some insurance requirements that they needed to provide to us, and we'd like to get some information on how every dollar is going to be spent in terms of how is the consultant or the materials or whatever selected. That's very important. And then what type of environmental reviews are needed with each dollar that's being spent as part of each individual sub-grantee's projects. So fairly intensive, consistent communication with the sub-grantees is continuing. And I guess if there's any kind of new news on the grant side, it ties into what's sitting here staring us in the face on the agenda that's remaining under the closed session, is we're still, with the board's support, looking at closing 2 potential deals to acquire some water rights and baseline pumping allocation. Staff didn't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we had been out there we've always been looking for grant opportunities, but the challenge had always been finding a willing seller. And the state does not like to get involved in grant opportunities where condemnation is required. So finding a willing seller was always a challenge. And fortunately, we've located a couple properties, the Bauer brothers, both David and William, that are looking like real good candidates. In terms of just BPA acquisition, and what makes the William Bauer parcel and a piece of the David Bauer parcel so interesting is their geographic location. They are literally right in the middle of Coyote Creek. And who was, I think Tammy and I were out there on the tour we had with David, and we looked over the fence, and David was saying, yeah, he can remember when his dad brought the bulldozer out there and just started grading Coyote Creek. And it looked just like what it looked like on the other side of the fence with the little mounds and the little flowers. And so they're out there just bulldozing the creek down. It's like, it's just surprising to me that the park didn't own that property forever, that somebody really could put a farm right there in the middle of Coyote Creek, but they did. And, it's been operating for what, 30-ish years. But that geographic location and its proximity to the creek creates some really unique restoration, revegetation, rehabilitation opportunities. And there are a handful of grants that are floating around out there, all with the focus for kind of environmental and habitat restoration. Finding a habitat restoration grant that also ties into the water supply and helping solve some of the needs of Sigma requirements and others has always been the challenge. The good news, we have really qualified legislative advocates helping us, and we found that a potential grant with the California Wildlife Board for the restoration, but that grant's really silent and mentions nothing about water rights and water supply purchases, so we're asking for a kind of interpretation from the Wildlife Board legal department on can the definition and the eligible projects under their grant be expanded to include water right acquisition, and we still have not heard the definitive answer yet. And then as part of our contingency planning, we're looking for plans B and C and D. And there was actually a Bureau of Reclamation grant that popped up a week or so ago. And then Jim Bennett, our good friend from Leanne from the county, they found an opportunity that popped up and Jim was calling me about yesterday. That's a conservation grant, and Jim actually volunteered to share a little bit of the information that he knew about it. He's done a little bit of investigative work and said, hey, Jim, this sure looks like it would be perfect for BWD. And so Jim or Leanne, if you are still there, I would love to share a little bit you found about this new grant opportunity and why you think it's so cool and why you forwarded it to us right away. That would be great. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So the Department of Conservation, they have a multi-benefit land repurposing program. They offered funds last year that the county went after. It's basically for the funding groundwater sustainability projects that reduce groundwater use, repurpose irrigated agricultural land, and provide wildlife habitat. And they really want grants that are a program where the community is working together, where you've got farmers, you have all the different entities within a community. They mention disadvantaged communities in which to develop repurposing strategies that have an educational component, have the ability to help bring sustainability of aquifers. They do offer the opportunity for farmers to be compensated as part of the overall grant. And so last year when we applied, we didn't have any shovel-ready projects, and that was really a detriment to our grant application. And I think having actual shovel-ready projects would definitely bring you up on the scale. They're currently offering $40 million, each grant worth up to $8.89 million each. And the grant application period is open right now, and they are due on March the 29th. They're going to have a virtual session on the 22nd to discuss it's going to be a grant workshop to better explain the application process. And we thought that this seemed like a potential fit for Borrego Water District, given that you guys have probably some of the best land in the basin potentially for restoration in an area of the Coyote Creek where it just has we last year when we applied, we have the grant application materials that we can make available. We also had gotten partnerships from Anza Borrego Foundation. The Anza Borrego State Park was certainly interested. and the water master as well had indicated partnering, and that's a requirement of the grant. DOC, the Department of Conservation, has a requirement that the grant applicant, which can be a public agency, so Borrego Water District is eligible, would need to partner with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And they understood we didn't have a GSA in our basin and were willing to accept the water master letter as a partnership letter. And partnership basically means that they'd be willing to share data, information, help with public outreach efforts. They wouldn't be directly working on the grant, but they would partner with being able to be a support in any way possible. So I provided all this information to Jeff along with a grant link to be able to look at the guidelines that are currently out.
Sounds interesting. Very exciting. Thanks for giving us a heads up on that, Jim. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I sure hope that it could be another potential. I know you guys are looking at all areas right now for how you can best take advantage of. Yeah.
It's a nice problem to have. We actually have land to play with now.
Yeah.
We almost, right? Not quite yet, but yeah, we're getting there. Right?
So, anything else, Jeff?
That's it, President.
Okay. All right then.
Is it
So I'm sorry?
Is it appropriate for public comment on this issue?
Yes, I was just about to ask for public comment. Mr. and Bob, would you like to make a comment?
Yes. Yes, well, it's a question. I'd like to know how I might stay updated on this granting process for the previously mentioned programs. As we all know, there's a pressure on some of the habitat with the removal of palm trees and nesting habitat for birds. So I think this puts the water district in a great position to create new habitat for the displaced animals and birds. So Jeff, if you could keep me posted or send me the link to that grant workshop so I can listen in, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Any other public comments? Any comments from anybody here, the directors or the public? Hearing none and seeing no hands going up, we have reached the end of our agenda for the public meeting. We're going to go into closed session. It is now 11:04. 5-minute break and we'll reconvene in closed session. Was there a link for that? I didn't see one, Jeff. Did you? Was there one?
Yes, they were sent out a little bit earlier. They were sent out to the board members.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, so we'll reconvene and take a little break and we'll meet again in 5 minutes.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.